Well, I think anytime there's political, social, cultural upheaval, people turn to scriptures and look at it in terms of a prophetic way. And of course, the 19th century was no different. We're coming off of the French Revolution, Napoleonic Wars. Of course, the midpoint of the 19th century is the Civil War. And people are trying to look for comfort, even some sort of escape, some explanation as to why the world's turning upside down. And so the 19th century, I don't think it was really much different from the way prophetic speculators have worked throughout the history of the world. You will find almost any political or religious candidate, set aside as the beast or the false prophet, the Antichrist. I think what we find with the 19th century, of course, is because of communication abilities, we saw a proliferation of this more than in any other time in history. When I first became a Christian, the talk about the end times was in the air. I had heard the gospel in 1973, in February of 1973, when I was a senior in college. And Late Great Planet Earth had just come out in 1970. And so the person who was witnessing to me was telling me about all these things that were going to take place. And I was raised Roman Catholic, knew very little about the Bible. And so I wanted to see these things for myself, so I picked up the Bible and started reading the Gospel of Matthew. And when I got to Matthew chapter 16, verses 27 and 28, it said very clearly, "Some who are standing here will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in His kingdom." And that just didn't fit with what Hal Lindsey was saying in The Late Great Planet Earth. Then I got to Matthew chapter 24, where it said, "This generation will not pass away until all these things take place." And I had just read earlier in Matthew where this generation was used, and it was referring to the generation to whom Jesus was speaking. Now, being a very new Christian, not having that much Bible knowledge, I really didn't know how to piece all of that together. And so I put eschatology on the shelf for a while. I went to seminary in 1974, and the issue of eschatology came up again, and I came across a little book by Marcellus Kick, which was written in 1948, and it was just called Matthew 24, and I read it. And in reading it, I saw this methodology, compare Scripture with Scripture. And so I went through Matthew chapter 24, following Marcellus Kick's analysis, and I began to see that every element in Matthew chapter 24 was mentioned somewhere else in Scripture. And so I was able to piece together how Matthew chapter 24 fit with the way this generation was being used in verse 34, and began to see that the New Testament was describing prophetic events that were to take place to a generation that Jesus was speaking to, not a distant future generation.